The morning sun had barely cracked over the Kentucky hills when James "Jimmy" Caldwell dragged himself out of his bunk at Fort Knox. It was March 1943, and the war in Europe was chewing through American tanks faster than Detroit could build them. Jimmy wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be back home in rural Tennessee, working his family's struggling farm, fixing tractors with baling wire and prayer. But Uncle Sam had other plans. At 22 years old, Jimmy had shoulders like an ox from years of hauling feed and mending fences. His hands were calloused, his face permanently sunburned, and his education stopped at 8th grade when his father died and left him to run the farm. The Army had drafted him 6 months ago, expecting to turn him into cannon fodder. Instead, they discovered he had an uncanny ability to fix anything mechanical. So they stuck him in the motor pool. The problem was, Jimmy wasn't like the other mechanics. He didn't have their training, their manuals, or their respect. To them, he was just a dumb farmhand who got lucky. They called him hillbilly, bumpkin. The guys from New York and Chicago made jokes about his accent, mimicked the way he said y'all and reckon. When he tried to share ideas, they laughed him out of the garage. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Pemberton, was even worse. Pemberton came from old money, attended Yale, and treated the enlisted men like children. He especially despised Jimmy, whose mere presence seemed to offend his sensibilities. That morning, Jimmy reported to the training grounds where a dozen brand-new M4 Sherman tanks sat idle. The Army had a crisis on its hands. Intelligence reports from North Africa showed German forces occupying mountainous terrain that American tanks simply couldn't navigate. The Sherman was a beast on flat ground, but ask it to climb anything steeper than 30 degrees and it would slide backward, track spinning uselessly, or worse, tip over backward and crush its own crew. Engineers from Detroit had been summoned. They brought blueprints, calculations, and prototypes. For 3 weeks, they'd been testing modifications. Heavier counterweights, modified track designs, engine adjustments. Nothing worked. The Sherman just wasn't built for mountains. Jimmy watched from a distance as another test failed. The tank roared forward, hit the incline, climbed 15 feet, then slid backward in a cloud of dust and diesel smoke. The engineers threw their clipboards down in frustration. During lunch break, Jimmy sat alone under an oak tree, eating the sandwich he'd packed that morning. His mind wandered back to the farm, to a problem he'd solved when he was 16. His father had needed to drag a broken plow up a steep hill to the barn. The tractor couldn't get traction. So Jimmy had rigged something simple, something his grandfather had taught him, using nothing but rope, pulleys, and physics that predated Newton. It had worked. He looked at the Sherman tanks, then at the hill, then back at his sandwich. His heart started racing. Could it really be that simple? Would they even listen to him? Probably not. He'd learned to keep his mouth shut. Every time he'd suggested anything, they'd shut him down. The educated men from the cities didn't want to hear ideas from a farmhand who could barely write his own name without misspelling half of it. But the idea wouldn't leave him alone. That afternoon, Jimmy approached Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton, who was standing with the Detroit engineers near a table covered in technical drawings. Jimmy's hands were shaking. He hated confrontation, hated being the center of attention. "Excuse me, sir," Jimmy said, his Tennessee drawl thick as molasses. Pemberton didn't even look up. "What is it, Caldwell? Make it quick. We're busy with actual work here." One of the engineers snickered. Jimmy swallowed hard. "Sir, I might have an idea about the hill problem." Now Pemberton looked up, his face a mixture of amusement and contempt. You have an idea that a team of mechanical engineers from General Motors hasn't thought of. Is that what you're telling me?" "Well, sir, I just thought maybe—" "Caldwell, do you have a degree in engineering?" "No, sir." "Do you have any formal education beyond elementary school?" "No, sir, but—" "Then I suggest you get back to changing oil and leave the thinking to people who actually know what they're doing." Dismissed. The engineers laughed openly now. Jimmy felt his face burning red. He turned to leave, but something made him stop. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the memory of his father telling him that a man who knows he's right shouldn't back down just because others can't see it. He turned back around. Sir, with respect, if you'd just give me 5 minutes and some rope, I can show you. The laughter stopped. Pemberton's face darkened like a thundercloud. Rope? You want to solve a $75,000 engineering problem with rope? Yes, sir. Just rope and a couple of pulleys. Pemberton stared at him for a long, terrible moment. Then his face broke into a cruel smile. All right, hillbilly. You want to embarrass yourself in front of everyone? Be my guest. You've got your 5 minutes. And when you fail, you'll be scrubbing latrines for the rest of your service. Do we have an understanding? Yes, sir. Jimmy's heart hammered in his chest as every eye on the training ground turned toward him. Word spread through Fort Knox like wildfire. The hillbilly mechanic was about to make a fool of himself. Within 20 minutes, over 100 soldiers had gathered around the testing ground, perched on jeeps, sitting on ammunition crates, all waiting to witness Jimmy Caldwell's humiliation. Jimmy tried to ignore the whispers, the laughter, the bets being placed on how quickly he'd fail. His hands trembled as he gathered what he needed from the supply depot. 300 feet of standard military rope, 2 heavy-duty pulleys, some iron stakes. The supply sergeant looked at him like he'd lost his mind. You gonna lasso the tank up the hill, cowboy? More laughter. Jimmy carried his materials to the base of the 60-degree incline where the Sherman sat waiting. His mouth was dry. His shirt was already soaked with sweat, and not from the Kentucky heat. Every step felt like walking to his own execution. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton stood with his arms crossed, checking his watch with exaggerated impatience. The Detroit engineers flanked him, smirking, one of them literally eating popcorn like this was a carnival show. Clock's ticking. Caldwell. You've got 4 minutes left. Jimmy's mind raced. He'd done this 100 times on the farm, but never with something weighing 30 tons. Never with his entire future hanging in the balance. What if the physics didn't scale? What if he'd miscalculated? What if he really was just a stupid farmhand playing pretend? He hammered the first stake into the ground at the top of the hill, his arms shaking. Someone in the crowd yelled, "He's gonna tie it down like a dog." More laughter rippled through the audience. The engineers whispered among themselves, just loud enough for Jimmy to hear. Jimmy threaded the rope through the first pulley, then the second, his fingers fumbling with knots his grandfather had taught him before he could read. The system was simple in theory, but everything depended on the angles, the anchor points, the distribution of force. 30 seconds, Pemberton announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Jimmy's vision blurred. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the rope twice. The crowd's laughter crescendoed. This was it. This was the moment everyone would remember. The dumb hillbilly who thought he was smarter than engineers. He'd be scrubbing toilets until the war ended. He'd never live this down. Never. He secured the final knot and stepped back, his chest heaving. Time, Pemberton said, clicking his watch closed with theatrical finality. Well, Caldwell, you've rigged up some rope. Congratulations. Now what exactly is this idiotic contraption supposed to do? Jimmy wiped the sweat from his forehead, looked at the Sherman, then at the rope system, then at the 100 faces waiting for him to fail. His voice came out barely above a whisper. It's gonna pull that tank up a 60-degree hill, sir. The entire training ground exploded with laughter. Pemberton wiped tears from his eyes. He was laughing so hard. Oh, this is rich. This is absolutely rich. Gentlemen, we've been wasting our time with physics and engineering when all we needed was some Tennessee farm magic. The engineers joined in, slapping their knees. One of them called out, maybe we should send him to the Pacific. He can lasso the Japanese planes right out of the sky. Jimmy felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but something else. The fear. The doubt. The part of him that cared what these men thought. He'd spent 6 months swallowing their insults, accepting their mockery, believing maybe they were right about him. But standing there, looking at that rope system he'd built with his own scarred hands, he knew something they didn't. He knew it would work. Not because he'd read it in a book or learned it in a classroom, but because he'd lived it. Because necessity and poverty had taught him things Yale never could. Sir, Jimmy said, his voice suddenly steady, I'm ready to demonstrate. The laughter died down to chuckles. Pemberton checked his watch again. Fine. Give us your little show. Then get yourself to the latrines. Jimmy climbed into the Sherman's driver's seat. The tank commander, a sergeant named Kowalski from Detroit, reluctantly took his position. He leaned over to Jimmy and whispered, "Look, kid, no hard feelings, but this ain't gonna work. Save yourself the embarrassment and just say the rope broke or something. Just watch, sir." Jimmy started the engine. The Sherman roared to life, 30 tons of American steel and firepower. He positioned it at the base of the incline, exactly where every other attempt had failed. The crowd quieted slightly, morbid curiosity replacing amusement. The rope system Jimmy had rigged wasn't complicated. It was ancient, a mechanical advantage system that multiplied force through simple pulleys and angles, the same principle that had built the pyramids 3,000 years before these engineers were born. On the farm, it had let a 16-year-old boy move a 2-ton plow with nothing but determination and geometry. Jimmy engaged the gears and pressed the accelerator. The Sherman lurched forward. The tracks bit into the dirt. The rope went taut, and the tank began to climb. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30. The crowd went silent. 40 degrees, 50 degrees. Someone gasped. 55 degrees, 60 degrees. The Sherman climbed that hill like it was a Sunday drive, smooth and steady, the rope system distributing the forces exactly as Jimmy knew it would. No sliding, no spinning tracks, no tipping backward. Just pure, simple physics that hadn't changed since Archimedes first said, "Give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world." If you're rooting for Jimmy right now, take a second and subscribe to this channel. Because what happens next changed military history forever. The Sherman crested the hill and came to a stop at the summit. For 5 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then Sergeant Kowalski stuck his head out of the hatch, looked down at the impossible angle they'd just climbed, and yelled 4 words that echoed across Fort Knox. Holy hell, it worked! The training ground erupted into chaos. Soldiers jumped off jeeps, shouting and pointing at the Sherman sitting triumphantly atop the 60-degree incline. The Detroit engineers stood frozen, mouths hanging open, their equations and blueprints suddenly worthless paper in their hands. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton's face had gone from smug superiority to pale shock in the span of 30 seconds. He stared up at the hill, then at Jimmy climbing out of the tank, then back at the hill, as if the laws of physics had personally betrayed him. Jimmy walked down the slope, his legs shaky but his head held high for the first time in 6 months. Soldiers he'd never spoken to were slapping him on the back, shaking his hand, asking him how he'd done it. The same men who'd called him hillbilly an hour ago were now treating him like he'd just won the war single-handedly. Sergeant Kowalski pushed through the crowd and grabbed Jimmy in a bear hug. "Kid, I don't know what kind of witchcraft you just pulled, but that was the smoothest climb I've ever felt in a tank. Smoother than flat ground." One of the younger engineers, a man named Harrison from Michigan, approached with genuine curiosity, replacing his earlier arrogance. "Caldwell, I need to understand the mathematics of what you just did. The force distribution, the angle of the pulleys, the load calculations. This shouldn't have worked. The weight-to-rope strength ratio alone should have snapped that line." Jimmy shrugged. "Don't know nothing about ratios, sir. Just know that if you multiply your pulling power through enough points, you can move just about anything. My grandpa used to say that 1 man with the right setup is worth 10 men with strong backs." Harrison stared at him. "That's mechanical advantage theory. That's literally classical physics. You just described a fundamental engineering principle. I described what works on a farm when you can't afford fancy equipment. The implications hit everyone at once. If a farmhand with rope could solve what teams of engineers couldn't, what did that mean for the war effort? How many other simple solutions were being overlooked because they didn't come from the right people with the right credentials?" Pemberton finally found his voice, though it came out strained. "Caldwell, report to my office immediately." Jimmy's heart sank. Here it came. The punishment for making a superior officer look foolish. The revenge for embarrassing the establishment. But as he followed Pemberton across the training ground, something unexpected happened. Soldiers lined up on both sides, and they started clapping. Slowly at first, then building into thunderous applause. Mechanics who'd ignored him for months were cheering. Officers were nodding with respect. Even some of the engineers joined in, their pride swallowed by the undeniable reality of what they'd witnessed. Jimmy walked through that gauntlet of approval with tears stinging his eyes, thinking about his father, about the farm he'd left behind, about every time someone had made him feel small for not having an education. Maybe knowing how to survive meant something after all. Pemberton's office felt different than Jimmy had imagined. He'd expected to be standing at attention while being dressed down, maybe even court-martialed for insubordination. Instead, Pemberton gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Caldwell." Jimmy sat, his back rigid, hands folded in his lap. Pemberton poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter, something Jimmy was certain violated about 15 military regulations. He slid one across the desk. Jimmy stared at it but didn't touch it. The lieutenant colonel leaned back in his chair, studying Jimmy with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to resignation, maybe even a trace of respect struggling against years of ingrained prejudice. "I owe you an apology," Pemberton said finally. The words seemed to physically pain him. "I underestimated you. Worse, I disrespected you based on assumptions that had nothing to do with your actual capabilities." Jimmy said nothing. He'd learned that silence was often the safest response. The War Department is going to want a full demonstration. They're already sending observers from Washington. What you did today, Caldwell, it's not just about climbing hills. It's about mobile warfare in terrain we've written off as impassable. Mountain ranges in Italy. The cliffs of Normandy if we ever invade France. Your system could save thousands of American lives. Jimmy finally spoke. "It ain't my system, sir. It's just old knowledge. Farmers and builders been using it for centuries. I just applied it different." Pemberton took a long drink. "That's exactly the point. We've been so focused on innovation that we forgot about adaptation. We brought in the best minds from the best schools and they couldn't see what was right in front of them because it was too simple, too old, too beneath their consideration." He stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds where soldiers were still gathered around the hill, examining Jimmy's rope system like it was an alien artifact. "I'm recommending you for a commendation. I'm also requesting that you be transferred to the Army Corps of Engineers as a technical consultant. They need people who can think outside the manual, who can improvise with limited resources. That's going to be crucial when we're fighting in bombed-out cities with supply lines stretched across an ocean." Jimmy felt dizzy. 6 hours ago he'd been scrubbing grease off tank treads. Now he was being offered a position that would put him in rooms with generals and strategists. "Sir, I don't have the education for that. I can barely write a report." Pemberton turned back to face him. "Then we'll get you a clerk to write your reports. What you have, Caldwell, can't be taught in any classroom. You have the kind of practical intelligence that wins wars. The kind of resourcefulness that keeps soldiers alive when everything goes wrong and the textbooks are worthless." He extended his hand across the desk. "I was wrong about you. Completely, utterly wrong. And I'm man enough to admit it." Jimmy stood and shook his hand, feeling the weight of vindication mixed with something unexpected. Forgiveness. Pemberton wasn't a bad man. He was just a product of a system that valued credentials over capability, pedigree over performance. "Thank you, sir." September 1945. The war was over. Jimmy Caldwell stood on the deck of a transport ship watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the morning fog as they approached New York Harbor. He was 24 years old now, though he felt decades older. He'd seen things in Europe that would never leave him. The beaches of Normandy, the rubble of Berlin, the faces of soldiers he'd helped save and those he couldn't. His rope system had been adopted across multiple divisions. Engineers had refined it, industrialized it, given it official designations and technical names. But soldiers in the field still called it the Caldwell method. His improvised pulley system had helped Sherman tanks navigate the cliffs above Omaha Beach, climb the mountains of Italy, and push through terrain the Germans thought was impassable. He'd received a Bronze Star, letters of commendation from generals whose names he'd only read about in newspapers. He'd worked alongside engineers who'd eventually stopped caring where he'd gone to school and started caring about what he could do. More importantly, he'd taught them to look beyond their assumptions, to listen to the mechanics, the farmhands, the men who'd learned through necessity rather than textbooks. Some of the war's most effective innovations had come from that shift in perspective. Simple solutions to complex problems, born from the minds of people who'd been invisible before. The ship docked. Jimmy collected his duffel bag and walked down the gangplank into a country that felt both familiar and foreign. New York was celebrating, streets packed with parades and confetti. But Jimmy just wanted to go home. 3 days later, he stepped off a Greyhound bus in rural Tennessee. The farm looked smaller than he remembered. His mother was waiting on the porch, older and grayer but with the same fierce eyes. She hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. His younger brother, Daniel, now 17, had kept the farm running. The crops looked good. The equipment was well maintained. Life had continued without him as it always does. That evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold, Daniel asked him about the war. Jimmy told him stories, carefully editing out the worst parts. When he got to the rope system, Daniel laughed. "You mean that old trick Grandpa taught us? That's what made you famous?" Jimmy smiled. "Sometimes the best solutions are the ones we've known all along. We just forget to look at what's right in front of us." Years later, Jimmy would open a technical school for veterans, teaching practical mechanics and engineering to men who'd come home from war with no formal education but plenty of hard-won knowledge. He'd marry a nurse from Kentucky, raise 3 kids, and never once mention his Bronze Star unless someone asked directly. But every time he saw a pulley, a rope, or a steep hill, he'd remember that March morning at Fort Knox. The day a farmhand proved that intelligence isn't about where you learned, but what you learned. That ingenuity doesn't require a diploma. And that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who changes everything. Thank you so much for staying until the end of this incredible true story. If this inspired you, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing what you thought, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories of underdogs who changed history. What kind of story would you like to hear next? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next one.